So today we're talking sales. More specifically, we're going to be talking about demand generation. So, just some broad definitions about demand generation. It is a marketing practice, it's also a sales practice aimed at creating awareness and interest in a company's products and services. It involves various techniques across numerous channels such as content marketing, social media, etc. It's been around for a long time, and but it's existed in I guess more of an evolving form in the last few decades. Welcome to Tech Uncensored, everyone. My name is Hessie Jones, and so one of the catalysts for this changing sales landscape since the advent of digital has been this decentralization of information. So in the past, a lot of companies who were primarily the holders of information about a company's products, the services, they actually use traditional marketing methods to actually promote them. So the internet and digital came along, and now these materials and information were more widely available. And so this decentralization gave rise to more platforms and channels of communication. And we've seen this in B2C, but also in B2B, where communities have risen, micro influencers. We see podcasts such as this one. We see more digital Slack groups. Companies had to adjust their marketing and demand generation to rely more on an engaged customer base, that in a way that was a lot more interactive and personalized as opposed to the one way. It's also evolved to include more things like marketing automation, predictive analytics, customer intelligence, to refine this process to make things a lot more targeted and efficient within this demand generation environment. So, my guest is Matthew Trotter, and he says now things are shifting again. The buyer journey is evolving, and 80% of what is happening of that is happening digitally. And he says that much of it is prior to the engagement with the sales team. So that's going to impact you as an organization. Rethinking your ideal customer profile. So, what is this order of new demand generation? What do sales teams need to do to improve their win rates, especially with this evolving buyer journey? So, Matthew, thank you for coming. I'll give you a little bit of background on Matthew. He has 25 years of experience in technology, sales, and consulting. He's an expert in data, AI, cloud solutions, with a proven track record in designing, positioning, selling, and delivering large scale and complex IT programs for some of the biggest enterprises. So he's a high performance sales coach as well, and co founder of Signal Led Sales, a groundbreaking sales framework to help a lot of go to market teams address some of these challenges with selling and this digital buyer journey. So, welcome, Matthew.
Thank you.
So, okay, so let's get into it. You've had a seasoned career in sales. So tell me about your perspective on demand generation, how it evolved over time. What did it look like 20 years ago when, I guess, when you started? I
Yeah,
wouldn't say 20 years ago when you
it's
started.
it, yeah, it's been a while for sure. And I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head earlier, which is this idea that there's a function of marketing, there's a function of sales. It's ultimately about how do we find opportunity, right? How do we find leads? How do we find deals? And then subsequently, work those deals through to close. So I think in the traditional sense, what we've seen over the last 20 years, and it really hasn't evolved much more in terms of a process, is you've got marketing who's out there, advertising. The advertising models have changed, right? Maybe not billboards on the side of the highway and, call it, pamphlets dropped at your door. But that was definitely a model and a system that was used for many, many years. And then, seeing that continue, it's just pay per click, it's advertising, it's banner ads on websites, right? It's brand awareness when we really think of the marketing element. And it's trying to make sure that everybody who's a potential customer understands who you are as a business and then understands the value you can drive for them, right? So that's one funnel of in. And then the other is this traditional kind of sales side, which is where you've got a sales team that's responsible for dealing with some of that inbound marketing, leads. But then there's also the outbound element of sales, which is now as a salesperson, I have to go and actually create my own opportunity, right? I have to look for customers. I have to go hunting, so to speak, prospecting, trying to identify who my best customers are going to be. I'm going to go, pursue those customers and then, bring them into the business. And that's still almost functioning in exactly the same way it always has. So we typically in that outside sales world, we would have someone in the, call it sales development or SDR role. And this person is typically making cold calls all day. They're sending emails and creating sequences where you're set up for 15 days of email, and you're going to get one email every 3 days, or then they're going to call you on the phone, and then they're going to reach out to you on social. And so this person's job is really to go out and just generate leads, which then subsequently get passed to the sales team, right? So an account executive or someone else in the company would take that, and then once that lead's been called it qualified, we now have a deal the sales team can chase. And this has existed for 20 years, right? And it's still very, very much the case today.
Okay. So, but you've said that this traditional demand generation is broken. And so you said you won't be able to buy your way out of this problem with tools. So what did you mean by that?
So it's the way I like to think of demand gen being broken is that the journey that the customer is taking today is an inherently digital journey. And you mentioned at the beginning this idea that 80% of buyers are going through this journey, or the journey, 80% of that journey is happening prior to engagement with a sales team. So the customer through digital means is able to do their own research, right? You've got all of these great websites, ability to review software. So the customer is self-educating most of the time, right? And they're going through the process of even getting pricing and quoting can all be done for the most part without engagement from sales. And the one to that statistic that you brought up, that journey, right? That's where Gartner expects the buyer's journey to be by 2025. Is 80% of it is happening prior to sales. What's interesting is the number of customers who don't want to talk to a salesperson, and those statistics range and vary, but they're in and around 50%. So you figure half of your customers don't want to talk to someone from sales. They want to do all of this research on their own. They want to get their answers on their own and make their decision generally on their own. So how we think about generating demand has to shift in order to address this change.
Okay, so was there, I'm not sure if it was a moment, but over time when you're looking at, let's say, your sales performance reports, how much of it became a visible problem that things needed to change? Like what were there any kind of outstanding metrics that identified that things weren't, that your sales were not keeping up with the amount of information that, let's say, customers were getting prior to and making their decision prior to even engaging with one of your sales reps?
Yeah, I think there's always metrics. Sales is probably the most metric driven company. And when you think of the sales development element, which is the cold calls, the emails, what conversion rates and so on, we're always looking at how are the emails getting opened? If they're opening, are they clicking on the emails? Are they following through with what's there? How many of those are converting into meetings? And I mean, hyper successful reps, right, are able, like, it's not necessarily dead, right? The idea of cold calling a customer is still a very great way of being able to kind of find these leads and generate leads. But I think the big difference is starting to look at some of these a particular incident that happened. And so Google, for instance, said they were going to clamp down on spam sending. And this just rippled through the sales community. And there was panic. There was mass panic. And they're saying, wait, they're going to shut off. If we send more than 5,000 messages to a domain, we're going to get shut off. And this is, it created such a huge concern. And that is just kind of like a small tip of the spear of what's wrong, because the answer that most salespeople are looking at when they see that is I send that much unsolicited mail
Mhm.
to people that I'm worried about being shut off by my mail servers, which is always a concern, right? There's so many tactics sales teams use to make sure they spin up new mail domains. They do all sorts of things to just keep this volume of messaging
Mhm.
happening. So we've all known this is inherently broken, and how we've solved it typically is a quantity and capacity side. So just produce enough output, and it will subsequently convert into opportunities. And so what we're not doing is using our resources as effectively as we could be, right?
Right. Right.
Um, and it's
Okay.
that conversion rate. And what you saw, 2023 was one of those years that I think was a big wake up call, especially for venture backed companies that had tons of funding, because the solution when you have a lot of funding is we can throw people at this problem. And so you end up with a bunch of money, you throw some people at the problem, and 2020, 2021, 2022, these were years where it was just, we saw the huge advent. Some of these sales, organizations were just growing and growing and scaling. And all of a sudden 23 hits, and there's this massive kind of downturn in economic, challenges with companies. They're kind of tightening their budgets. And what do we do with this giant pool of people who are here trying to cold call and email everyone? And it just didn't produce any results. And some of the best performing startups and companies and growth companies that were doing great in 2020 to 2022 saw 2% growth in 2023. And they couldn't sustain those teams. So all of a sudden it was, okay, we've got to cut. And it just became this massive kind of layoff structure within sales of how do we reduce this team. And now, so they have less people and they still have to deliver growth and output, which
Mhm.
means we've got to get smarter about how we're using those
Right.
resources.
So was it do you think the amount of layoffs that kind of forced people to figure out a different way to become more efficient? Because you said throwing people at a problem, and sales traditionally has been, the more people, more seasoned sales reps, the higher the sales probability, right? And you're saying not necessarily.
No, and it's sales is an expensive organization. We are, ultimately the most costly organization in a business. So it became typically what happens when you see budgets clamping down and you start seeing some of those economic headwinds.
Mhm.
Sales organizations tend to shift. Instead of trying to find net new customers, they tend to focus on how do we maximize the revenue we have with existing customers, right? So there's this kind of
Yeah.
this readjust internally. Um, but you can't just stop finding new customers. You still need to
Right.
continue growing your new logos, right? And so the shift is how they retain, right? So they can cut their churn rates by having better focus on customers, right? So the whole organization just kind of focuses on let's retain the base, what we've got. And then we still have this outside sales team that's here. And the idea was, okay, we've got less people. We still have the same number of customers, potential
Right.
customers. How do we focus on who we should be calling? Because we have 1/3 the number of people to do it. And this is where the evolution kind of had to happen almost organically, where the smartest sales reps, and this wasn't necessarily something done from the leadership level where it was just mandated. This was sales reps going, how can I be smarter about what I do every day? Because
Mhm.
this is not sustainable. And so you saw almost this like groundswell change of reps trying to find ways to be successful. And it was like, well, I have to be ruthless about not talking to customers that aren't going to produce a result I need. And I really have to focus on the ones who are.
Okay. So tell me about that. You say the buyer journey has changed. So it's almost like this new variable that starts to surface that actually now addresses something that could be more effective in the sales process.
Yeah. So with the buyer doing a lot of that research, and not really wanting to talk to sales. I think there's a lot of folks who inherently think, okay, well then this is a marketing problem, right? And that's
Always find the marketer. Yes.
yeah, right. As a salesperson, you never want to just sit back and be like, okay, I'm just going to wait for marketing to solve all of my issues, right? So you get creative and you have to think about this. And so the magic word that kind of came to light was this idea of intent, right? So I can sell my product to millions of different types of customers, but if I have a limited resource, which is time, and I can only focus on the ones I need to focus on, how can I refine this? And so this is where the idea of the ideal customer profile came in, right? So we started, and this again has been pretty similar for the last decade. And it's creating a firmographic view of who your ideal customer is, right? So you make a product, maybe it's ideally targeted at healthcare institutions who are between 1,000 and 5,000 users, and they make $500 million or $1 billion in revenue. Whatever the case may be, you've created some guardrails for your sales team to say these are the customers you want to go after, and that's kind of removed the chaff from your prospecting goal. And that's great, but that's still very wide. And there's a huge number of those customers that aren't able to buy, are in no position to be able to buy. Perhaps there's no budget, there's nothing going on in their business that potentially would justify. Maybe they've got a competitive product and they're perfectly happy with it. They've got a 3-year contract. All of that information is completely irrelevant when you use just the firm data and the particular person or buyer you would be speaking to. So that's where it started. That evolved over the last couple of years and moved into this, what I like to call ICP-V2, which is where now sales teams wised up and said, hey, is there some sort of compelling event that can happen that we can use to layer on top of all of this firm data that we have to, again, narrow the guardrails and say, who can we talk to? And that started with, it was a big one, was around things like job changes, or what we would call like second buyer revenue. So somebody worked at a company that had your product and they ended up moving to a different company that doesn't have your product. Well, if they've had good experience with your product and they've gone to another company, that's a compelling event we can potentially capitalize on to get them to buy your product again. So second order revenue, right? That idea, or movement into a role, right? A person goes from being a VP of marketing into a CMO, right? They want to make some waves. They've got this new job. Great. How can I help empower that? You being successful in this job change. So they started adding these compelling events. And that's where it sat historically. That's kind of where it's been. Mm-hmm. And then what I'm essentially proposing is this idea of moving now the ICP to include buyer intent, right? And this is where we want to get those guardrails down even further, because 80% of that journey is happening without us. Why aren't we just focusing on the fraction of customers within our account books who actually have intent to buy? Right. And I think about conserving my time, which is limited, to focus on customers who actually are going to be of the higher propensity to purchase.
Okay. So when you talk about the customers with the highest propensity, are there existing customers, I would assume, right? So, or how do you apply that to a prospect? Because so you have to go down the funnel at some point.
Yeah, it can be both, right? And I mean, how we've tried to look at this is very much from the sense of net new customer acquisition. So almost ignoring the existing customer base, so to speak. And we think of this as new logo acquisition. So how do we find this, right? And this is the idea that intent can exist in a number of different ways. So we've had to kind of classify the different types of intent. And we're starting to see, I think 2023 was that big year where you started to see a number of software companies spin up that were like, hey, we need to help solve this intent problem in sales, because this is going to help, refine focus and get people, targeting the right customers. And so we saw this big spin up of intent focus. And the idea behind intent is that there's kind of 3 real core types of intent. And we, call that 0-party intent data, 1st-party intent data, and 3rd-party intent data. And third-party intent data has existed for years. There's tons of different types of competitive intelligence solutions that can, talk to you about what a customer currently owns, if they've got investment or if that customer has been attending certain types of events or webinars or things. You can buy that data, right? You can get that from a third party that's able to kind of educate you on that customer's intent. First party intent data is really what you're capable of leveraging as an institution yourself. So if you're a product company and you make a piece of software, a customer who's using a free trial of your application for 14 days is potentially going to be doing things within that application, which can be signals that, hey, they're actually showing intent in certain areas, and this is what we need to be focusing on. And there's interaction with your existing website and how they browse and use that content, right? Or they're downloading white papers, and what type of white papers are they using? And then, so that's your first party side. And then you go to the zero party, which is social media has really enabled this. And it's now starting to look at the individual within your buyer's committee, because for the most part, it's not just a single person who's buying products. There's usually a few people who are involved in that. Depending on how complex your solution or product is, there could be 10 people involved in that purchasing decision, or it could be a very small transactional product where you only have one or two people. But it's starting to look across all of those different personas and being able to identify individual action that has happened, signals, to be able to say, okay, they're showing intent. So this person has participated in a webinar that we hosted that was available, or this person posted on social media about this article that they read on, cybersecurity challenges within the industry. And we're starting to use all of those signals that are happening across the individual. So now we combine these different types of intent, and we can create a picture of, essentially who within our account set actually has interest and intent in buying our product.
Okay, so now you have all these signals and you have all these different data sources. How do you get them all into one dashboard so it makes it easy for your sales reps to do all this?
Yeah, so that today has been a historically challenging problem because you have 100 different places, to your point of where this data can reside. Sales reps, and just speaking from experience, we're inherently lazy when it comes to where I want to get my data from. So it'd be great if they could all be in one place. We are starting to see solutions existing in the marketplace that are designed to collect all of this information and pool it. Startups that are being built around this because they're realizing that this disconnected data ecosystem is a problem. So, this is where the evolution of sales tooling is essentially going. Like, how can we collect all of this information? But it really is only kind of addressing the first part of this, which we talked about, which is intent, right? Yeah. So it's like, okay, great, we have intent. But as sales organizations, how they're handling intent is kind of the way we've been doing it for the last 20 years in terms of customer interaction and engagement. Is as soon as a customer shows intent, we haven't done any sort of evaluation on what that intent means or why they're showing this intent. We don't have that information yet. We haven't done that digging. And we reaction instead. We immediately say, intent has created a reaction, and our reaction is call the customer or email the customer. And that's the limited amount of direction we provide. So as a sales organization or a sales maker, I'm basically told this customer has intent, go call them. And it's a very generic answer.
Absolutely.
Right. And it's leaving so much on the table, especially when you think the customer would prefer to probably not talk to you. So you're just calling out of left field and saying, hey, I noticed you've been clicking around the website and you've done all these things. Any chance you want to hop on a call? Probably not. I'm more than happy to continue hopping on the call. What value are you adding to this conversation? And that's
I just want to add in there, just because I've been on the other side from a marketing perspective, is like, what are the different incentives that you as a marketer can do to try to get people to take action, right? And so everything, like from my direct marketing days, has always been about attribution. What specific thing did you do that made them go to the conversion page? They may not have converted, but they got there. So what other things can you do to actually get them to go further, right? And so things like clicks or impressions were so far away from the conversion mark that downloading a white paper seemed to get closer to it, because if they're interested in downloading the white paper, then obviously there was some kind of relevancy that was attributed to that specific action. But now you're going further and you're saying, it's not really all that stuff, because they may want to download that white paper, but they do not want to hear from you at all. So what are the specific signals that you're looking for when you're trying to discern like the best path forward for customers?
Yeah, I think there's one thing you said there that I really want to kind of touch on, which is this idea that they don't want to talk to you, right? And it's when they don't want to talk to you, how are you able to even get in here? And I want just everybody to just remind themselves of why you don't want to talk to a salesperson. And it's having been someone who's been in this for a long time, it plays back to a very simple thing. It's like, I am not adding value. Right? If I'm capable of adding value to a customer will happily have a conversation with me. But more often than not, and I mean, just open your inbox, there's a lot of completely irrelevant, valueless conversations that are trying to be started, which says, I'm going to just ignore this. So, it's getting ourselves back in this head of, how can I, as a salesperson in this new world, add value? And it's not, oh, they've shown intent, call the customer. Oh, they've shown intent, they've done this, call the customer. It's being able now to say, they've shown intent. This is the intent that they've shown. Why? Like, let's understand what it is that's caused that, why it's happened. But let's then subsequently create, and this is what we call within the system, an intercept, which is relevant to the type of intent or signal that we see, right? So, a person, to the point of downloading a white paper, that white paper says something specific, right? There's a particular outcome. It's aligned to a particular industry. There's some piece within that white paper that makes it intent-based and relevant to your potential customer. The answer is not go call the customer. It could be. That could be through your evaluation that the very next step, the correct next step, is call the customer. But for the most part, it might not be. It might actually be, if this is the thing that's of interest to the customer, the correct next step could be, here's an invitation to a webinar we have that's talking about these exact things, right? Because that is of value, right? And it's understanding that if you can continue to add value, the customer will be way more receptive to wanting to interact with you as a salesperson.
Right? You're actually trying to remove that whole old adage about the used car sales guy who is willing to talk to anybody to try to improve his sales close rates. But from this perspective, it looks like, if you identify the right customer at the right time from the beginning, then it probably will make you more effective, right? And efficient, I would say, right?
Yeah, 100%. And it plays back to just this idea, the Pareto principle of, if I have 500, 1,000, 3,000 accounts, especially in that sales development type role where you are handed lists of customers, it's very rare that as a sales development rep, you'd end up with 30 customers on a list. You're going to end up with hundreds, if not thousands of customers to call and dial every day, every month. The question becomes, okay, great. How do I reduce this, narrow my guardrails so I can actually tier all of these customers into, these are high priority because we can filter for intent, and we know that these customers are the ones we need to actually curate the journey for, and be able to have an actual plan of attack, right? So there's kind of the two elements. The first is the planning side, which is how can I be better focused with my time? reduce who I'm trying to reach out to, because my time is protected and limited. And then the second element is, once I know that these are the people I'm reaching out to, what are the actions and steps that I take in response to each of these types
Mhm.
of intent signals? And that's what's missing today. That's what's broken. So we have all sorts of sales companies who've gotten on the wagon of intent. Intent's important. We got to do intent, right? Okay, cool. Now there's all sorts of intent systems, and people are starting to build all of these tools and frameworks around intent. But what they haven't addressed is the generic response of the signal or the intent, right? They're not actually coming up with a real, what is the next step in this journey? How am I
Mhm.
curating this journey? It is a very action reaction type of approach versus
Right.
we've created the journeys appropriately based on the types of actions and intent signals that customers are showing us.
Okay. So I would assume that that's going to be like a test on a case by case basis until you figure out like what are the best practices when it comes to like these specific intents. Is that right?
Yeah, there's no hard and fast rule on what equals what, right? Each company and product team, each marketing team, your product is unique, right? How it works, right? The
Mhm.
people who consume your product, right? The people who sell products to security teams versus people who sell products to marketing teams, completely different personas. And so the exercise is really going through taking your ideal customer profile and starting to now map intent, both at the zero, first, and third party layer, and understand when we have these signals. So this is how we're going to filter our account list down to the customers that we really need to focus on. And then throughout the quarter, and whenever we're pursuing these customers, what are the exact actions that we take based on the types of signals and intent that we see, right? A
Okay.
very specific journey. And marketing is a piece of this, right? They potentially can, overlay, and they're doing their own kind of cover fire on these accounts, and they're still doing their thing. But the sales team really needs to make sure their time is focused in the area it needs to be focused in.
Yeah. And I would think it would go back to first principles, like being really a good listener. And once you have them, now it's like just validating that through conversation, right?
Yeah, it's think of like being a good listener now as being, we kind of talk about this idea of the SDR role has to evolve into an intent analyst, a person who
Okay.
can look at this intent data and then subsequently identify what we need to do with it to be able to say, okay, here's our focus area. This is how we're going to respond to this customer. We're curating this journey so we can create a better buyer, right?
Yeah.
Because remember, the buyer's self-educating. So
Yeah.
if I just leave buyers to their own, thing, the company with the best marketing website and all the best reviews on the internet is going to be the one that wins.
Yeah.
And so I can't do that as a salesperson, right? I have to be able to try to, shift that conversation, but do so in a way that's actually, aligned with these different types of signals and intent. So that,
Okay.
that building a better buyer is really that idea that we're trying to embrace here.
It seems to be obviously a lot more dynamic these days, so you have to keep on top of the customer. Okay, so last question. So your company is developing this method through signal-led sales. So what's been your experience so far in applying this framework, and what has been the outcome compared to not using it before?
Yeah, so it's had a massive change in terms of amount of outreach, right? So what we're seeing is just this reduction in amount of outreach, uh,
Mhm.
and that, I think, for a lot of organizations is a big, it's a scary topic, right? They're always worried about, hey, if I go into my HubSpot and I'm sending tens of thousands of unsolicited messages, there's a very real possibility HubSpot might shut me off, or I'm violating the terms of use of these mass mailing solutions because I really don't have the customers, consent to be, doing all of this cold outreach. So seeing a massive reduction in that is kind of step one, right? And then the focus area really makes sure that we're having more informed and intelligent discussions with the customer. You're still going to always find situations where this information is available, but the rep who's potentially engaging with the customer hasn't, taken the time to really consider that information. But the reps who are in tune with kind of the approach and why it makes sense are definitely seeing a higher outcome in terms of, more informed conversation with the customer, better understanding of what the customer is looking for, which is leading to one, faster opportunity conversion rate. So from the time the opportunity shows up until the time the opportunity closes, seeing that time horizon reduced because there's way better understanding of exactly what's happening. And then being able to actually increase, wins within the account because you have actually influenced that customer's buying journey before any other vendor had the opportunity to potentially do it because they were in the same boat. And this is the thing you have to remember. If everyone's using intent, because these tools are, if you're using the intent data, your competitors are using the intent data, everybody's apparently educated on intent. How are you differentiating your sales motion versus someone else? And it's really on the intercept aspect of this, which is what are we doing in reaction to the signal, right?
It almost like you need an AI to actually beat them at their own game if you all have the same data. But I mean that I think that's learning, right? And that's it's being able to have access to that information as it becomes available to be able to do that.
Access is one piece, right? Like, and again, it really does play back when you think of a sales organization, you are trying to find your way to have a leg up. And when everyone has access to the same tools, right? You look at the sales tooling world, right? This is why you can't buy yourself out of this problem. Everyone can buy the answer, but it's not actually the answer. It's really only one component. And the second component is having an accurate and effective strategy for what does this mean and how can I subsequently then guide the customer without them feeling like sales is adding no value to this, right? And all of a sudden my sales team is actually highly valuable and they're actually influencing this buyer journey.
Okay, perfect. That was a great closing remark, Matthew. Thank you so much. This is going to be valuable because we have a lot of startup organizations that are getting to a point where they do have to scale, right? And they're trying to do it in ways that is less tools based, but more, I would say, I don't know if they could use their gut to define when's the right time to talk to somebody. It is really intent, and if you think about it, it's more intuitive than you think. But now we're trying to somehow operationalize it right in our systems so that we can be effective and create maybe a standard or a process overall within the organization.
Yeah. And I mean, this is the playbook model, right? Like a sales leader who has a playbook and says, this is how I do things. The interesting thing that, I see is that you've got sales leaders who saw great success in 2019, 2020, 2021, built these playbooks around this model that was really built on scale and having a lot of money being pumped into the organization. It's like, oh, we'll solve this problem. You want to go from 10 million to 100 million? Awesome. We just throw 30 SDRs at this. They go cold call people. We bring all. And the reality is that funding vehicle doesn't exist. That money's not there. And it's work smarter, not harder, which is kind of the new world. And so those playbooks that were built aren't exactly relevant in a lot of cases. Like, yeah, there's some good stuff in there, but we really do have to shift to efficiency in how we do outbound.
That's awesome. Okay. So intent-based selling, the new order for demand generation. Thank you so much, Matthew, for taking the time to providing some of these really, really helpful tips for our founders to increase their sales effectiveness. I'd love to connect you with some of them if they're interested in learning about the most efficient ways to become more effective in closing deals. So for our audience, thank you. If you have any topics that you want us to cover, please email us at communications@altitudeaccelerator.ca. In the meantime, everyone, have fun and stay safe.
Thanks, Essie.
Thank you.